It was a Friday night, and I was the only one working the closing shift at the small convenience store where I'd been for about 6 months. It was around 11:30 p.m., an hour before I was supposed to lock up, and for most of the night, it had been dead. Only a few customers had come in all evening. I was behind the counter scrolling through my phone, just trying to stay awake. That's when the door chime rang, and this guy walked in. He looked a little older, maybe late 30s, early 40s, with scruffy hair and wearing this old, beat-up jacket. At first, nothing really seemed off. He grabbed a drink from the cooler and came up to the counter, but as I was ringing him up, he just started asking weird questions. "You here by yourself?" he asked casually, like it was a normal thing to ask. I felt a pit in my stomach, but forced a smile and said, "Oh no, my manager's in the back," which of course wasn't true. He just stared at me for a second, then asked, "When do you get off?" My heart started pounding. I didn't want to seem scared, so I shrugged and said, "I don't know, soon." He smiled, this weird, creepy smile, and said, "I'll be waiting." I froze, unsure if I'd heard him right, but before I could respond, he took his drink and left the store. I watched him through the glass door as he walked to the parking lot, but he didn't leave. He leaned up against the side of the building, right under the streetlight, just staring at the entrance. I was terrified. My mind was racing, thinking about what I should do. I didn't want to leave, knowing he was out there. I texted my friend to come pick me up, pretending like I wasn't completely panicking. The next hour dragged by, with me glancing up every few minutes to see if he was still there. And every time, he was, just standing there. At midnight, I grabbed my stuff and made my way to the back exit, hoping to slip out unnoticed. But as soon as I stepped outside, there he was, waiting for me in the alley. He must have known I'd try to leave that way. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely breathe. He smiled and took a step toward me. But just then, my friend's car pulled up, and I bolted. I didn't look back. The next morning, I told my manager everything, and they checked the cameras. But the footage was fuzzy, and they couldn't make out his face. I never saw him again, but I quit that job a week later. I wasn't going to stick around to see what happened the next time. I used to work at this old gas station off a highway in the middle of nowhere. It was one of those places where you might get a handful of customers all night if you were lucky. The gas station had this eerie, quiet vibe that always made me a little uneasy, but the pay was decent, and I needed the money. It was a little after 1 a.m., and I was in the back restocking some shelves when I heard the bell above the door jingle. I walked out to the counter and saw 2 guys standing there. They were rough-looking, dirty clothes, messy hair, and that kind of wild-eyed look that made my stomach twist. Something about them didn't sit right with me. They didn't grab anything from the shelves. They just stood there, talking quietly to each other. I tried to act casual, but my mind was screaming at me to be careful. I asked if they needed help with something, but they just glanced at me, didn't say a word. Then one of them, the taller one, leaned over the counter and said, "How much cash you got in the register?" I froze. He wasn't smiling. I knew this was bad. My heart started racing, but I kept my voice steady. I said, "Not much. It's all card payments nowadays." He looked at his friend, and they exchanged this look. It was like they were deciding whether to do something. The taller guy leaned back, and they both started wandering around the store. But they weren't picking anything up. They were watching me, whispering to each other. My skin was crawling. I didn't know if they had weapons or what their plan was, but I wasn't about to find out. I reached down slowly and pressed the emergency button under the counter that calls the cops. It felt like hours passed before I heard the faint sound of a police siren. As soon as the siren echoed in the distance, the two guys looked at each other, and without saying a word, they bolted out the door and into the night. The cops showed up a few minutes later, but the guys were long gone. They checked the security cameras, but the angles weren't great, and the footage didn't show much. They never caught them, and I don't even want to think about what might have happened if the cops hadn't shown up when they did. I never worked another night shift after that. This happened during my senior year of high school, when I was working at a fast food joint to save up for college. I worked the late shift, usually closing up around midnight, and it was mostly uneventful. But this one night still haunts me. It was about 11:45 p.m., and the last few customers had already left. I was in the back, cleaning up and getting everything ready to close, when this guy came in. He was older, mid-40s maybe, and looked off. His clothes were wrinkled and dirty, and his eyes were bloodshot like he hadn't slept in days. He didn't order anything right away. He just stood there, staring at the menu. After a minute, I asked if I could help him, and he mumbled something about needing to use the bathroom. I pointed him toward the restrooms, and he walked off. I kept working, assuming he'd leave soon, but after 10 minutes, he still hadn't come out. I knocked on the door and asked if everything was okay. No response. I felt uneasy, but I figured maybe he was just taking his time. Another 5 minutes passed. It was almost midnight, and I was supposed to lock up. I knocked again, harder this time, and yelled that the restaurant was closing. Still no response. I thought maybe he'd snuck out when I wasn't looking, so I grabbed my keys to lock the door and get out of there. But as I walked past the bathroom door, something told me to check. I opened it, and there he was, huddled in the corner of the stall, trying to hide. My heart stopped. He looked up at me with this wild look in his eyes, like he'd been caught doing something horrible. I didn't even say a word. I just turned and ran for the front door, slammed it shut, and locked it. I could hear him moving around in the bathroom, so I called the police. When they showed up, they dragged him out of the stall, kicking and screaming. Turns out, he had a knife in his jacket. He'd been waiting for me to close up, probably planning to rob me or worse. If I hadn't checked the bathroom, I don't even want to think about what could have happened. That was my last shift at that place.